The wind carried a different scent on the morning Emperor Frederick Valois arrived at the summer palace. Sage, lemon, and something undefinable, perhaps hope. After 3 years of military campaigns solidifying the borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he sought refuge in the rolling hills of Baden, where the Imperial family had retreated from Vienna's oppressive summer heat for generations. Frederick dismounted his stallion, his joints aching from weeks in the saddle. At 32, he had already endured more battles than his father had in his entire reign. The summer palace stood like a beacon, its pale stone facade glowing in the morning light, promising respite from the weight of his crown. "Welcome home, your Imperial Majesty," the palace steward bowed deeply, his white gloves immaculate against his dark uniform. "Thank you, Horvath," Frederick replied, removing his riding gloves. "I trust everything is prepared." "Indeed, your Majesty. Though we received word of your arrival only yesterday. The staff has worked through the night." Frederick nodded, suppressing a smile. He had intended it that way, to arrive with minimal ceremony. The formal celebrations in Vienna had drained him. Here, he sought solitude. "The minister's dispatches should be brought to my study," he instructed, striding through the grand entrance. "I'll receive them after I've bathed." "Of course, your Majesty." The marble halls echoed with his footsteps as he made his way toward the east wing. Servants scurried out of his path, bowing deeply, their eyes lowered in deference. He acknowledged them with slight nods, too accustomed to their presence to truly see them. Until he collided with one. The impact wasn't forceful, but it was enough to scatter the armful of fresh linen she carried. White sheets billowed to the floor like surrendering flags. "Forgive me, she began, dropping immediately to her knees to gather the fallen linens, her face hidden as she scrambled to collect them. Frederick stepped back, momentarily startled by the collision. In his fatigue, he'd failed to notice her approaching. "The fault is mine," he said, surprising himself with the admission. Emperors rarely accepted blame, even for trivial matters. When she looked up, Frederick felt an inexplicable shift in the air between them. Her eyes, the deep blue of a mountain lake, met his without immediately darting away in prescribed deference. For 3 disorienting seconds, she looked at him not as an emperor, but as a man who had carelessly bumped into her. "Dorina," came an urgent whisper from down the corridor, and the spell broke. The girl's eyes widened with delayed recognition, and she quickly lowered her gaze. "Your Imperial Majesty, please forgive my clumsiness," she murmured, her voice musical despite her evident distress. Frederick found himself studying her more carefully than protocol would deem appropriate. She wasn't dressed as a common housemaid. Her attire was simple but of good quality, a pale blue dress with minimal ornamentation, her chestnut hair braided and coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. "You are new to the palace staff?" he inquired. She began, still kneeling. "Stand," he commanded, then softened his tone. "Please." She rose gracefully, clutching the linens to her chest like a shield. "I am not staff, your Majesty. I am Dorina." A matronly woman in the black dress of a lady's companion hurried toward them, her face pale with alarm. "Your Majesty," she curtsied deeply. "Please excuse us. Lady Dorina Balogh is still learning the palace protocols." Lady Dorina. The name struck Frederick like a misplaced chess piece. The daughter of Count Balogh, Hungary's most influential nobleman. Frederick had approved her appointment as lady-in-waiting to his widowed mother, the Empress Dowager Helena, but he'd expected a mature woman, not this girl who couldn't be older than 20. "Lady Balogh," he acknowledged, his tone cooling to its customary imperial distance. "I wasn't informed you had arrived." "Yesterday evening, your Majesty," she replied, her composure returning. "The Empress Dowager requested my immediate attendance." "And she has you carrying linens?" A fleeting smile touched her lips. "I offered to help. The palace is understaffed with your Majesty's unexpected arrival." Unusual. Ladies-in-waiting didn't typically concern themselves with household duties. Before Frederick could respond, his private secretary appeared at the end of the corridor. "Your Majesty, the diplomatic pouch from St. Petersburg has arrived." Frederick nodded. "Lady Balogh, I trust you will find your position with my mother educational." He turned to leave, then added, "and perhaps learn to navigate the corridors with more attention." "Yes, Your Majesty," she replied, curtsying perfectly this time. As Frederick walked away, he was uncomfortably aware of the lingering warmth in his chest, a sensation entirely inappropriate for an emperor who had recently rejected marriage proposals from 2 European princesses. Dorina's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the emperor's retreating figure. Mrs. Kovacs, her companion since childhood, clutched her arm with trembling fingers. "Do you realize what you've done?" the older woman hissed. "Colliding with the emperor himself. And then looking directly into his eyes." "It was an accident," Dorina whispered. "And I didn't immediately recognize him. He's younger than his portrait suggests." "That is no excuse. Your father secured this position with great difficulty." "If you embarrass the family, I won't," Dorina promised, adjusting the linens in her arms. "But I'm not going to cower like a frightened rabbit either." The Empress Dowager specifically requested someone who could read to her in Hungarian. She values authenticity. Mrs. Kovacs sighed. "Authenticity has its place, but so does protocol. Come now, we mustn't keep Her Imperial Majesty waiting." As they continued toward the Empress Dowager's apartments, Dorina replayed the encounter in her mind. Emperor Frederick Valois had been nothing like she expected. His portraits depicted a stern, almost forbidding figure, the legal emperor who had ruthlessly crushed rebellions and faced down the Russian Tsar during the Eastern Crisis. In person, despite his formal manner, she'd glimpsed something else beneath the imperial facade: fatigue, certainly, but also a flash of genuine humanity when he'd admitted fault for their collision. And his eyes. They were the warm amber of autumn sunlight through brandy, fringed with dark lashes that softened his otherwise severe countenance. "Stop daydreaming," Mrs. Kovacs murmured as they reached the Dowager Empress's antechamber. "Remember who you are and why you're here." Dorina nodded, composing herself. She knew exactly why she was here. Her father had made it abundantly clear, her position as lady-in-waiting was strategic, placing a Hungarian noblewoman close to the imperial family at a time when tensions between Austria and Hungary threatened the dual monarchy's stability. Count Balogh expected his daughter to be his eyes and ears at court, reporting anything that might affect Hungarian interests. What her father didn't know was that Dorina had her own reasons for accepting the position. After 3 years of rural isolation following her broken engagement to Baron Esterhazy, she craved purpose beyond the confines of her father's estate. When the opportunity arose to serve the Empress Dowager, who shared her Hungarian heritage, Dorina had seized it with both hands. "Lady Balogh," the Empress Dowager's chamberlain announced as they entered the sunlit sitting room. Empress Helena sat by the window, her once famous beauty now softened by age. At 65, she retained the regal bearing that had captivated Europe during her husband's reign. Her silver-streaked hair was arranged simply beneath a black lace cap, her mourning for Emperor Maximilian now entering its 4th year. "Come closer, child," she beckoned, her accent still carrying traces of her Hungarian childhood. "Let me look at you properly." Dorina approached and curtsied deeply. "You have your grandmother's eyes," the Empress Dowager observed. "I knew her when we were girls in Budapest. She danced like an angel and spoke her mind like a general." A smile softened her features. "I hope you've inherited both qualities." "Your Imperial Majesty honors my family with such memories," Dorina replied. "Sit," the Dowager Empress instructed, gesturing to a nearby chair. "And tell me, how did you find my son? I understand you've already made his acquaintance." Dorina's cheeks warmed. "News travels quickly at court. The palace has more ears than a field of corn. Now, your honest impression, please." Dorina hesitated, aware of Mrs. Kovacs's warning look from across the room. "His Majesty seems preoccupied, Your Imperial Majesty. The weight of empire shows in his bearing." The Empress Dowager studied her thoughtfully. Most would have offered empty compliments. "Interesting." She reached for a leather-bound book on the table beside her. "You read Hungarian, yes? Not just speak it?" "Fluently, Your Majesty." "And German?" French, and English as well. Good. We shall start with this, Petfier's collected poems. His revolutionary sentiments nearly got me banished from court when I was first married. She handed Dorina the book. Page 37, if you please. Freedom and Love. As Dorina began to read the famous poem in her native tongue, she noticed the Empress Dowager close her eyes, transported by the familiar rhythms of a language she rarely heard at the Austro-Hungarian court. Behind the closed doors of these private apartments, away from the German-speaking courtiers, the old empress seemed to shed years of imperial formality. What neither woman noticed was Emperor Frederick pausing in the corridor outside, arrested by the sound of Hungarian poetry flowing from his mother's chambers, and by the melodic voice of the woman he had mistaken for a servant just hours before. Frederick retreated to his study, irritated by his own distraction. The diplomatic dispatches from St. Petersburg demanded his full attention. Rumors of Russian military movements along the Ottoman border could signal another Balkan crisis, yet his thoughts kept returning to that brief encounter in the corridor. Lady Dorina Balogh. The name resonated with political implications. Countess von Balogh was among the most vocal advocates for Hungarian autonomy within the empire, though he stopped short of calling for independence. His loyalty had been questioned during the rebellions of Frederick's youth, but never proven wanting. Appointing his daughter as lady-in-waiting to the Empress Dowager, herself born to Hungarian nobility, was a calculated political gesture. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called. His private secretary, Baron Riedel, stepped in with a fresh stack of correspondence. "The Hungarian delegation's petition, Your Majesty," he said, placing a document atop the pile. "They request an audience next week regarding the language provisions in the Education Act." Frederick sighed. "The same demands as last year, I presume. With additional provisions for cultural autonomy in Transylvania. Schedule them for Tuesday. 1 hour, no more." Frederick turned his attention back to the Russian dispatches, signaling an end to the conversation. Once alone, he found himself again thinking of Lady Balogh. Was her appointment merely coincidental with this renewed Hungarian pressure? Few things happen by chance in imperial politics. Determined to focus, Frederick immersed himself in state matters until evening, when tradition required him to dine with his mother. As emperor, he could have easily excused himself, but their weekly dinners were a promise he had made at his father's deathbed, one of the few personal commitments he honored without fail. The Empress Dowager's private dining room was intimate by palace standards, accommodating no more than 12 guests. Tonight, only 3 places were set at the long table. Frederick, his mother greeted him warmly, extending her hand. "You look tired, my son." "The empire doesn't rest, mother, so neither can I," he replied, kissing her offered hand. "Always so serious. Your father could separate statecraft from supper, at least." She gestured to the third place setting. "I've invited my new lady-in-waiting to join us. I believe you've already met." Before Frederick could respond, Lady Balogh entered, having exchanged her simple blue dress for an evening gown of deep burgundy. The color highlighted the warmth of her complexion and the rich chestnut of her hair, which was now arranged in a more elaborate style befitting a formal dinner. "Your Imperial Majesties," she curtsied gracefully. Frederick acknowledged her with a nod, noting the transformation. This poised noblewoman bore little resemblance to the startled girl clutching linens that morning. "Lady Balogh has been reading Petfi to me," his mother said as they took their seats. "It reminds me of my childhood in Budapest." "Revolutionary poetry," Frederick remarked. "An interesting choice." "All great poetry contains some revolutionary spirit, Your Majesty," Lady Balogh replied, her voice calm but her eyes alert. "Even when it speaks of love rather than liberty." "And does Count Balogh share his daughter's literary tastes?" Frederick asked, watching her reaction closely. "My father prefers historical treatises, Your Majesty. He says poetry clouds judgment with sentiment." A hint of a smile played at her lips. "I maintain that poetry reveals truths that history often obscures." The Empress Dowager chuckled. "Well said, my dear. Frederick, you should hear her read." Her Hungarian is pure music, not the mangled version I hear from most of the court who attempt it. Throughout dinner, Frederick observed Lady Balogh with growing curiosity. She spoke intelligently on various subjects, from music to the recent excavations at Pompeii, revealing an education unusual for most noble women. Yet she skillfully avoided political topics, deflecting his subtle probes about Hungarian affairs with graceful neutrality. When his mother mentioned the upcoming summer ball, the social highlight of the season at Baden, Frederick saw an opportunity. "Lady Balogh, do you dance?" he inquired. "When the occasion permits, Your Majesty." "Then I shall claim your first waltz at the ball," he stated, rather than asked. "As a courtesy to my mother's companion." Surprise flickered across her face before she composed herself. "I am honored, Your Majesty." Later, as Frederick escorted his mother back to her apartments, she took his arm and said quietly, "She's not what you expected, is she?" "I'm not certain what you mean." "Don't play the emperor with me, Frederick. I was choosing ladies-in-waiting while you were still learning to walk. You thought I'd selected a Hungarian spy, or at least a political pawn." "The thought had occurred to me," he admitted. "And now?" Frederick considered before answering. "She's more complicated than her father's politics would suggest." His mother patted his arm. "The most interesting people always are. Good night, my son." As Frederick returned to his study, he found himself already anticipating the summer ball, a sentiment he hadn't experienced in years. The following week passed in a blur of duties for Dorina. Mornings were spent reading to the Empress Dowager Hungarian poetry, but also French novels and English newspapers. Afternoons often found her transcribing the Empress's correspondence, learning the complex web of relationships that connected Europe's royal families. She saw the emperor only at formal occasions, at a military review, a diplomatic reception, where he performed his duties with effortless authority, never betraying the fatigue she had glimpsed on their first meeting. Each time, he acknowledged her with a polite nod, nothing more. Yet Dorina felt his attention like a physical presence. Occasionally, she would glance up from her book or conversation to find his amber eyes observing her from across a room, his expression unreadable. "He's curious about you," the Empress Dowager remarked one afternoon as they walked in the palace gardens. "Frederick doesn't waste attention on people who don't intrigue him." "I'm merely your lady-in-waiting, Your Majesty." "There's nothing intriguing about that." "There's everything intriguing about a Hungarian nobleman's daughter who carries linens and quotes revolutionary poets." The old empress paused beside a rose bush, inhaling its fragrance. "My son lives in a world of people who want things from him. Power, favor, position. He's developed a keen sense for detecting ulterior motives." "And what does he detect in me?" Dorina asked, unable to help herself. "That's what fascinates him, he isn't sure." The empress touched a bloom gently. "What does your father expect from your position here, child?" "The truth, please." Dorina hesitated, then decided honesty was safer than evasion with this perceptive woman. "Information, Your Majesty. The Hungarian Diet is concerned about the Education Act and its implications for our language and culture." The Empress Dowager nodded. "As they should be. And have you provided such information?" "I've written only of your kindness and the palace gardens." "Nothing of substance." "Because there's nothing to tell, or because you choose not to tell it?" "Both, Your Majesty." The Empress smiled. "A diplomatic answer. You'll do well at court." She resumed walking. "My son receives the Hungarian delegation tomorrow. The meeting will not go as they hope." "May I ask why?" Dorina ventured. "Frederick sees concessions as weakness. His father was too accommodating, in his view. It led to expectations that couldn't be fulfilled." She glanced at Dorina. "He's wrong, of course. Strength can be shown through compromise as well as command." That evening, Dorina penned a carefully worded letter to her father, explaining that the Hungarian delegation should moderate their demands and focus on practical compromises rather than sweeping cultural autonomy. She wrote nothing of her conversations with the Empress Dowager, framing her insights as observations of court sentiment. As she sealed the letter, Dorina recognized the increasingly difficult position she occupied. Her father expected loyalty to Hungarian interests, while her growing respect for the Empress Dowager pulled her toward imperial perspectives. And then there was the Emperor himself, a man whose public persona revealed so little of the complexity she sensed beneath. The night before the Hungarian delegation's audience, Dorina was returning from the palace library when she noticed light spilling from the Emperor's study. Passing the partially open door, she glimpsed Frederick hunched over his desk, surrounded by documents, his formal jacket discarded and his hair disheveled from running his fingers through it. She must have made some small sound, for he looked up suddenly. "Who's there?" Dorina had no choice but to step into view. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I was returning to my quarters and saw the light." Frederick straightened, but didn't reach for his jacket. In his shirt sleeves, with his cravat loosened, he looked younger, more approachable. "Lady Balogh." "It's late for reading," he observed, nodding toward the book in her hands. "Gibbon's A Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire," she explained, showing him the volume. "The Empress Dowager mentioned it, and I realized I'd never read it. Heavy material for bedtime." A ghost of a smile crossed his features. "Though perhaps instructive for understanding how great empires crumble. Or how they might be preserved, Your Majesty." Frederick studied her for a moment. "Come in, Lady Balogh. Since you're interested in the fate of empires, perhaps you can offer a perspective on the matter at hand." Dorina hesitated at the threshold. Being alone with the Emperor in his private study at night was beyond improper, it was potentially scandalous. Reading her concern, Frederick added, "Leave the door open. Your reputation will survive 5 minutes of political conversation." She entered cautiously, approaching his desk. Papers were arranged in neat stacks, a map of the empire spread beneath them, various regions marked with colored pins. "Tomorrow I meet with the Hungarian delegation," he said, gesturing to a document. "They demand greater control over educational curriculum, particularly language instruction. They want Hungarian taught as the primary language in all schools within Hungarian territories." "And Your Majesty opposes this?" Dorina asked carefully. "A common language unites an empire, Lady Balogh. German is the language of administration, commerce, and military command throughout our territories. While Hungarian is the language of 1,000 years of our history and culture," Dorina replied, then immediately worried she'd overstepped. Rather than taking offense, Frederick regarded her thoughtfully. "Your father's argument, I presume?" "My own observation, Your Majesty. Hungary's nobility speaks German fluently, we're educated in it from childhood. But the ordinary people hold to their mother tongue as part of their identity. And if I grant this concession, what will be demanded next? Separate Hungarian military units? A Hungarian parliament with actual power rather than symbolic authority?" Dorina chose her next words carefully. "People fight hardest for what touches them most intimately, Your Majesty. Language is how mothers speak to their children, how people pray, how they express love and grief. Grant them this, and many other demands may lose urgency." Frederick was silent for a long moment, his amber eyes searching hers. "You argue persuasively for Hungarian interests, Lady Balogh. I would expect nothing less from Count Balogh's daughter." "I argue for the empire's interests, Your Majesty. An empire strengthened by respecting its diverse peoples, not weakened by forcing them into uniformity." The clock in the corridor chimed midnight, breaking the tension between them. "It's late," Frederick said, straightening some papers. "And tomorrow will be challenging. Good night, Your Majesty." Dorina curtsied and turned to leave. "Lady Balogh," he called softly. When she looked back, he added, "Thank you for your candor. It's a rare commodity in these halls." The following afternoon, word spread through the palace that the Emperor had granted limited concessions to the Hungarian delegation, allowing Hungarian language instruction in primary schools while maintaining German for secondary and university education. It was a compromise that satisfied neither side completely, yet both claimed it as a victory. When Dorina next encountered Frederick at a garden reception, he acknowledged her with a slight inclination of his head, a gesture almost imperceptible to others, but one that conveyed mutual understanding between them. That night, she wrote to her father of the emperor's surprising wisdom in finding middle ground. The letter completed, Dorina stood at her window overlooking the palace gardens, wondering if a single conversation could truly influence imperial policy, or if the emperor had simply used her to justify a decision he had already reached. Either possibility was unsettling in its implications. As the summer ball approached, Frederick found himself distracted during state business, his thoughts drifting to Lady Balogh with increasing frequency. Their midnight conversation had revealed an intelligence and conviction he rarely encountered, especially in the young noblewomen presented as potential consorts. The Russian ambassador requests clarification of our position on the Ottoman railway concessions, Baron Riedel was saying, drawing Frederick back to the diplomatic dispatch before him. Tell him our position remains unchanged, Frederick replied, signing the document. The economic benefits outweigh Russian concerns about strategic disadvantage. Once alone, Frederick moved to the window overlooking the palace gardens, where he could see his mother walking with Lady Balogh. The younger woman was gesturing animatedly, describing something that made the Empress Dowager laugh, a sound Frederick hadn't heard often since his father's death. Over the past weeks, he had made discreet inquiries about Lady Dorina Balogh. His intelligence officers reported her broken engagement to Baron Esterhazy 3 years prior, allegedly because she had refused to convert from Catholicism to his Protestant faith, though court gossip suggested deeper complications. Since then, she had lived quietly on her father's estate, declining several eligible suitors despite approaching an age when most noblewomen were long married. Most intriguing was a report from his Hungarian ministers that Count Balogh had initially opposed his daughter's court appointment, relenting only when she had threatened to join a convent. If true, it suggested Lady Balogh had sought the position for personal reasons, not merely to advance her father's political agenda. The night of the summer ball arrived with perfect weather, the palace gardens illuminated with thousands of lanterns that transformed the grounds into a fairy tale landscape. As tradition dictated, Frederick opened the festivities with his mother, leading her through the first dance before duty required him to partner the wives of senior diplomats and ministers. Throughout these obligatory dances, he was keenly aware of Lady Balogh across the ballroom. She had danced with several partners, including the French ambassador's son and a Hungarian count whose family had historically opposed her father's faction. Her burgundy gown, the same color she had worn at their first dinner, stood out among the pastels favored by most of the younger women. When the orchestra began the introduction to a Strauss waltz, Frederick excused himself from the Russian ambassador's wife and made his way through the crowd. Conversations hushed as he approached Lady Balogh, who was conversing with a group of Hungarian nobles. Lady Balogh, he said, extending his hand. I believe I claimed your first waltz. Your Majesty, she curtsied, her composure perfect despite the sudden attention from everyone nearby. This is actually the third waltz of the evening. Then I'm fortunate you saved it for me, he replied smoothly, leading her onto the dance floor as murmurs spread through the ballroom. The emperor rarely danced with unmarried women unless they were being considered as potential matches. By publicly claiming Lady Balogh as a partner, and for a waltz, the most romantic of dances, Frederick knew he was setting the court gossips ablaze. As they took their positions, he noted the slight tremor in her hand before she placed it on his shoulder. Her other hand rested lightly in his as they began to move with the music. You dance well, Lady Balogh, he observed after their first turn around the floor. Thank you, Your Majesty. Though I suspect that's not what everyone is whispering about at this moment. Frederick smiled slightly. Court gossip concerns itself with trivialities. Let them whisper. It's hardly trivial when the emperor singles out a Hungarian noblewoman for attention, she replied, her blue eyes meeting his directly. Particularly with tension still unresolved between Vienna and Budapest. Perhaps I'm employing a different diplomatic strategy, he said, guiding her through a graceful turn. One that doesn't involve formal declarations or policy papers. Using a dance to suggest imperial favor toward Hungarian interests. Her eyebrow arched skeptically. That seems unlike Your Majesty's usual direct approach. I wasn't thinking of Hungarian interests at all, Frederick admitted, surprising himself with his candor. Merely of a midnight conversation about empires and identity that has occupied my thoughts more than state affairs should allow. Color rose in her cheeks, but her gaze remained steady. Your Majesty honors me with such consideration. Yet you doubt my sincerity. I question your motivation, she corrected gently. As Emperor, every gesture carries political weight, whether intended or not. And as Count Balog's daughter, your presence here carries similar weight, Frederick countered, executing another perfect turn. Yet I find myself wondering if you came to court for your father's purposes or your own. The music was building toward its crescendo, and Frederick drew her slightly closer than protocol strictly permitted. He felt her inhale sharply, but she didn't pull away. Perhaps both purposes aligned more than either of us anticipated, she replied. As the waltz ended, they stood momentarily still amid the swirling dancers, connected by more than just their clasped hands. Frederick was acutely aware of the eyes upon them, of the implications his actions would generate. Walk with me in the gardens, he said quietly, not phrasing it as the Imperial command it was. Dorina hesitated. That would be unwise, Your Majesty. Then wisdom must occasionally yield to necessity. He offered his arm. I find I need air that isn't thick with speculation and court perfume. After a moment's deliberation, she placed her hand lightly on his arm, and they made their way toward the terrace doors. The Empress Dowager, observing from her seat of honor, raised her fan to hide a smile. The night air carried the scent of roses and freshly cut grass as they descended the marble steps into the illuminated gardens. Frederick guided them toward a secluded path bordered by tall hedges, where the music faded to a distant melody and the lanterns cast intimate pools of golden light. Your Majesty, Dorina began once they were beyond immediate earshot of other guests. Whatever you intend by this attention, Frederick, he interrupted. When we're alone, I would hear my name from your lips, not my title. She looked startled. That would be most improper. As is this conversation, this walk, this entire interaction, he acknowledged with a rueful smile. Yet here we are. They continued in silence for several paces before Dorina spoke again. You risk much by showing such marked attention to someone of my position. And what position is that, exactly? Hungarian noblewoman? My mother's companion? Political envoy? Or simply a woman who looks at me and sees Frederick rather than his Imperial Majesty? She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. In the lantern light, her eyes appeared deeper, more mysterious. I see both, your Frederick. And that is precisely why this is dangerous. Dangerous, he repeated, taking a step closer. An interesting choice of word. The most accurate one, she replied, not retreating. For both of us. Frederick reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, and touched her cheek with surprising gentleness for hands accustomed to wielding imperial authority. I have spent my life calculating risks and consequences, Dorina. The danger here is one I accept willingly. Before she could respond, voices approached from a neighboring path. Frederick dropped his hand and they resumed walking, maintaining a proper distance between them as a group of Russian diplomats passed, bowing deeply to the Emperor. Once alone again, Dorina said quietly, we should return to the ballroom. Your absence will be noted. It already has been, Frederick replied, but turned them toward the palace nonetheless. At the foot of the terrace steps, he paused. The Imperial family travels to Schönbrunn next week. My mother has already indicated she intends to bring you. Yes, she mentioned it this morning. Good. Frederick hesitated, then added, I find court business is more bearable when punctuated by midnight discussions on empire and identity. A smile touched her lips. Perhaps Schönbrunn's library contains other volumes worth examining by candlelight. I look forward to discovering them, Frederick replied, his voice carrying a warmth rarely heard in imperial pronouncements. They rejoined the ball separately, Frederick returning to his diplomatic duties while Dorina was immediately surrounded by curious ladies eager for details. Neither revealed anything of their garden conversation, but observant courtiers noted the Emperor's unusually relaxed demeanor for the remainder of the evening, and the way his gaze repeatedly sought out a certain lady-in-waiting in a burgundy gown. The journey to Schönbrunn Palace brought a welcome change of scenery, with Vienna's grandeur replacing Baden's pastoral charm. Situated on the outskirts of the capital, Schönbrunn had been the imperial family's primary residence for generations, its yellow facade and vast gardens symbolizing Habsburg power throughout Europe. For Dorina, the transfer meant adapting to a more formal court atmosphere, where her position as the Empress Dowager's Hungarian lady-in-waiting drew increased scrutiny from the predominantly Austrian courtiers. She felt the weight of disapproving glances from ladies whose families had served the imperial household for centuries. "Ignore them," the Empress Dowager advised as Dorina helped arrange her collection of miniature portraits in her new apartments. "They treated me the same way when I first arrived from Hungary as a young bride. Their approval isn't worth seeking." "I'm not seeking approval, Your Majesty. Merely trying to fulfill my duties without creating unnecessary tensions." The old Empress laughed softly. "My dear, your mere presence creates tension, as does the attention my son has shown you. The court thrives on such undercurrents." Dorina carefully placed a miniature of the late emperor on the mantelpiece. "Your Majesty, regarding the emperor's attention, I'm old, child, not blind," the Empress Dowager interrupted. "Frederick hasn't shown interest in any woman since that unfortunate affair with the Duchess of Montenuovo 3 years ago. His sudden enthusiasm for Hungarian culture and midnight library visits isn't motivated by imperial policy." Blushing, Dorina adjusted the portrait's position. "I've given him no encouragement, Your Majesty." "Haven't you?" "Perhaps not intentionally." The Empress studied her thoughtfully. "You're different from the women usually presented to him, less calculating, more genuine. He finds that refreshing." "I'm not being presented to him," Dorina protested. "I'm your lady-in-waiting, nothing more." "For now," the Empress replied enigmatically, turning her attention back to her portraits. That evening, a formal dinner welcomed the imperial family back to Schönbrunn. Seated far from the emperor at the long table, Dorina was placed between an elderly Austrian general and a middle-aged diplomat whose conversation never strayed from hunting and horses. Throughout the meal, she felt Frederick's occasional glance from the head of the table but maintained proper decorum, participating politely in the limited conversation her dinner companions offered. After dinner, the court assembled in the great gallery for music, a string quartet performing Haydn. As the musicians played, Dorina became aware of someone approaching from behind. "Lady Balogh," came the emperor's voice, pitched low for privacy despite the public setting. "I trust you're finding Schönbrunn to your liking." She turned, curtsying. "Yes, Your Majesty. The palace is magnificent. Yet you seem less at ease here than at Baden." His perception surprised her. "Schönbrunn has more established traditions, Your Majesty. I'm still learning them." Frederick nodded, understanding her diplomatic phrasing. "The library here is particularly impressive. The Eastern Wing contains works in Hungarian that might interest you, historical manuscripts collected during my grandfather's reign." "Thank you for the recommendation, Your Majesty. I shall explore it when my duties permit." A slight smile touched his lips. "Perhaps this evening, after the concert? I find midnight research has become something of a habit recently." Before she could respond, the Austrian Chancellor approached, needing the Emperor's attention on some state matter. Frederick excused himself with a meaningful glance that left Dorina both unsettled and anticipatory. Later that night, after ensuring the Empress Dowager was comfortably settled, Dorina debated the wisdom of accepting the Emperor's implied invitation. The Baden Palace had been relatively intimate, its summer atmosphere more relaxed. Schönbrunn operated with rigid protocol, its corridors patrolled by imperial guards and populated by servants even at late hours. Curiosity, and something deeper she was reluctant to name, ultimately drew her to the library in the Eastern Wing. The vast room was dimly lit by a few oil lamps, its towering shelves creating shadows that danced across ancient volumes. Initially appearing empty, the space revealed Frederick seated in a leather chair near the fireplace, a book open on his lap and his formal evening attire replaced by a simpler dark jacket. He looked up at her entrance, setting aside his book. "I wasn't certain you would come." "Nor was I," Dorina admitted, remaining near the doorway. "This is more complicated at Schönbrunn. Because there are more eyes watching." Frederick stood, approaching her with unhurried steps. Or because here I am more evidently the emperor and less the man you encountered at Baden? Both, she said honestly. The distinction between Frederick and his imperial majesty seems less clear in these halls. He gestured toward the shelves behind him. I found several volumes of Hungarian poetry. Your influence has expanded my literary interests beyond military strategy and diplomatic theory. A dangerous development for an emperor, she replied with a hint of a smile. Indeed. Next I might develop other inconvenient interests, in justice over expedience, in genuine connection over political alliance. He stopped an arm's length from her. In Hungarian ladies-in-waiting over appropriate imperial consorts. Dorina felt heat rise to her cheeks. Your Majesty, Frederick, he corrected gently. Frederick, she conceded, whatever this is between us cannot proceed. You know this as well as I do. What I know, he replied, is that for the first time since assuming the throne, I find myself thinking of personal happiness alongside imperial duty. An emperor is permitted few indulgences, Dorina. This small joy of conversation with you, must I deny myself even this? His vulnerability, so at odds with his public persona, touched something deep within her. Conversation is innocent enough, I suppose. Then let us converse. He guided her to a small seating area near a window overlooking the nighttime gardens. Tell me of your life before court. Your broken engagement, perhaps. Dorina tensed. You've made inquiries about me. Of course, Frederick acknowledged without apology. I make inquiries about everything that interests me. But I would rather hear your account than my intelligence officers. After a moment's hesitation, Dorina decided on honesty. Baron Esterhazy was chosen by my father, a political match to unite two Hungarian noble houses with different approaches to Vienna. I accepted because it was expected, not from any particular attachment. Yet you eventually refused him. He demanded I convert to Protestantism and renounce certain personal principles I held dear. She looked down at her hands. When I declined, he questioned whether I could be a proper wife if my conscience outweighed my obedience. That clarified matters considerably. Frederick's expression darkened. He sounds like a fool. He was practical, Dorina corrected. He wanted a wife who would conform to his family's traditions and political interests. I wanted. She trailed off. What did you want? Frederick asked softly. Something I couldn't name then. Purpose, perhaps. The freedom to think and speak without constant calculation of consequences. She met his gaze directly. I still want those things. Even knowing they may conflict with imperial interests. With my interests. Especially then, she replied. What value would my thoughts have if they were merely echoes of what you wish to hear? Frederick studied her for a long moment. You're unlike anyone at court, Dorina Balogh. That is unlikely to recommend me to your advisers, she observed wryly. My advisers don't determine my private associations. But they influence your public ones, and an emperor has few truly private moments. Dorina rose from her seat. It's late. I should return before my absence is noted. Frederick stood as well. May I see you here tomorrow night? Prudence urged refusal, but Dorina found herself nodding. To discuss Hungarian literature, of course. Of course, he agreed, the hint of a smile playing at his lips. Nothing more scandalous than poetry and history. As Dorina slipped back through the quiet corridors to her quarters, she acknowledged the perilous path she was walking. These midnight conversations might remain innocent, but the feelings developing between them were increasingly complex and potentially disastrous for both their futures. Over the following weeks, their nighttime meetings in Schönbrunns library became an unspoken ritual. Always beginning with discussions of books or art, their conversations inevitably deepened to more personal territories, childhood memories, private doubts, quiet aspirations rarely voiced in daylight hours. Frederick found himself sharing burdens he concealed even from his closest advisers, his conflicted feelings about his father's more conciliatory approach to empire, his his doubts about his own harsher policies, his loneliness despite being surrounded by courtiers and ministers. In turn, Dorina revealed her complicated relationship with her father's political ambitions, her spiritual struggles after breaking her engagement, and her growing uncertainty about her role at court as the line between duty and personal attachment blurred. During daylight hours, they maintained proper distance. At state functions and court gatherings, the emperor acknowledged Lady Balogh with the same formal courtesy he showed other attendants to his mother. Only the Empress Dowager noticed the subtle changes, how her son's expression softened momentarily when Dorina entered a room, how the Hungarian lady's cheeks colored slightly when the emperor spoke near her. "You're playing a dangerous game," Mrs. Kovacs warned Dorina one evening while helping her dress for dinner. "The court whispers about your midnight disappearances." "I'm merely exploring the library," Dorina replied, though her flushed cheeks betrayed her. "And if the emperor happens to be exploring it at the same time?" The older woman shook her head. "Child, nothing good can come of this. He cannot marry a Hungarian countess, no matter how noble your lineage. Such matches are not made outside of fairy tales." "Marriage has never been discussed," Dorina protested. "We simply talk." Mrs. Kovacs gave her a knowing look. Hearts rarely confine themselves to what is merely discussed. The warning troubled Dorina, though she didn't acknowledge its accuracy. That night, she hesitated before going to the library, questioning the wisdom of continuing these meetings that had come to mean so much to her. When she finally arrived, later than usual, Frederick was waiting with evident concern. "I feared you wouldn't come." "I considered it," she admitted. This grows more complicated with each passing night. Instead of their usual seats by the window, Frederick led her to a small door concealed behind a tapestry. "Come. I want to show you something." The hidden door opened to a narrow staircase that spiraled upward to a small, circular room at the top of one of Schönbrunn's towers. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Vienna, its lights twinkling in the distance like earthbound stars. "My childhood refuge," Frederick explained. "When court life became overwhelming, I would escape here with books and dreams." "It's beautiful," Dorina breathed, moving to the windows. "Like seeing the empire from heaven's vantage." "I've never shown this to anyone else," he said quietly, standing beside her. "Not even my closest friends during youth." The intimacy of this admission hung in the air between them. When Dorina turned to respond, she found Frederick watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Why me?" she asked. "Of all the people at court, why share your confidences with a Hungarian noblewoman you barely know?" "Because when I mistook you for a servant that first day, you looked directly into my eyes without fear or calculation," he answered. "And in that moment, before you knew who I was, you saw me and not the crown or the title, but the man. No one has truly seen me since my father died." "Frederick," she began, but whatever she intended to say was lost as he closed the distance between them, his hands gently framing her face. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, "and I will never speak of this again." Dorina knew she should step away, invoke propriety and duty and all the reasons this could not be. Instead, she lifted her hand to cover his. "I can't tell you what I don't wish." Their first kiss was tentative, almost reverential, an acknowledgement of boundaries crossed and consequences deferred. The second dissolved those considerations entirely, deepening with shared longing too long constrained by position and protocol. When they finally separated, Frederick rested his forehead against hers. "This complicates everything." "Yes," she agreed, her voice barely audible. "Yet I find I cannot regret it." His amber eyes searched hers. "Can you?" Dorina thought of her father's political aspirations, of court expectations, of imperial tradition centuries in the making, all standing in opposition to this impossible connection. "No," she answered truthfully. "Though perhaps tomorrow I will find wisdom that escapes me tonight." They remained in the tower room until the small hours, sometimes talking, sometimes simply holding each other in comfortable silence, postponing the inevitable return to their separate worlds of duty and decorum. When dawn threatened on the horizon, Frederick escorted her through secret passageways to a corridor near her quarters. Before they parted, he pressed something into her hand, a small key. "For the tower room," he explained. "Should you seek refuge or companionship when I'm unavailable." The gesture's significance, giving her independent access to his most private retreat, was not lost on Dorina. She closed her fingers around the key, knowing it represented far more than mere entry to a physical space. "What happens now?" she asked. Frederick's expression grew solemn. "Now we face what we've been avoiding. Questions of future, of duty, of possibility." He touched her cheek gently. "I won't ask you to live in shadows, Dorina." "Yet for now, shadows are all we have," she replied. "For now," he agreed. "But not forever. I need time to consider how to proceed without creating a diplomatic crisis or undermining the very empire I'm sworn to protect. And I need to examine my own conscience," Dorina acknowledged. "My position here comes with responsibilities to your mother, to my family." "Then we shall both think carefully," Frederick said, "and meet tomorrow night with clearer minds, if not lighter hearts." With a final, lingering kiss, they separated, the emperor to his private chambers, and Dorina to her quarters, where she carefully hid the tower key in a small compartment of her jewelry box. Neither slept that night, their thoughts consumed by possibilities both exhilarating and terrifying. For Frederick, the political implications of his feelings for a Hungarian noblewoman threatened carefully balanced power arrangements throughout the empire. For Dorina, personal happiness seemed increasingly at odds with familial duty and the role she had accepted at court. By morning, both had reached the same painful conclusion: heart must yield to duty, at least until a path forward could be found that wouldn't sacrifice either's principles or obligations. They didn't meet the following night, nor the night after. When they encountered each other at court functions, their interaction was flawlessly proper, betraying nothing of what had passed between them. Only the Empress Dowager noted the shadows beneath her son's eyes and the forced quality of her lady-in-waiting's smile. A week after their tower room encounter, Frederick departed suddenly for the eastern provinces, where border disputes required imperial attention. He left without private farewell, sending only a formal note to his mother explaining his absence would extend at least a fortnight. Dorina received no communication, not even a discreet message through trusted servants. The tower key remained hidden in her jewelry box, untouched. "He will return," the Empress Dowager commented one afternoon, watching Dorina stare absently into the gardens. "My son doesn't abandon what matters to him." Dorina turned, startled by the old Empress's perception. "I'm sure His Majesty has more important concerns than timely farewells to his mother's attendants." "Indeed," the Empress replied with a knowing smile. "Important enough to send him fleeing to the farthest reaches of the empire, seeking clarity through distance." She patted Dorina's hand. "Valois men have always believed running away from their feelings somehow diminishes them. They invariably discover otherwise." Before Dorina could respond, a palace messenger arrived with correspondence for the Empress Dowager. Among the letters was one addressed to Lady Dorina Balogh, not in the Emperor's hand, but bearing the seal of her father, Count Istvan Balogh. With the Empress's permission, Dorina withdrew to read it privately. The contents left her pale and shaking. My daughter ***, rumors of inappropriate attention from His Imperial Majesty have reached Budapest. While such imperial favor might ordinarily benefit our family, current political circumstances make this situation untenable. The Hungarian Diet prepares to challenge imperial authority more directly than ever before, and your position as both my daughter and the object of the Emperor's apparent affection creates impossible conflicts of loyalty. ***, I have arranged your betrothal to Count Mihaly Teleki, whose support for Hungarian autonomy aligns with our family's interests. The marriage contract has been signed, with only your signature required to finalize arrangements. A proxy will bring the documents to Vienna within the week. ***, this match secures your future and clarifies your position during these uncertain times. I trust you will recognize the necessity of this arrangement and fulfill your duty to family and country without delay. ***, your father ***. Count Istvan Balogh ***. Dorina's hands trembled as she refolded the letter. Her father had promised never to arrange another marriage without her consent after the disaster with Baron Esterhazy. Now, threatened by rumors of her relationship with Frederick, he had broken that promise, using her as a political chess piece to solidify his position among Hungarian nationalists. Count Telecki was twice her age, a widower known for his anti-Vienna sentiments and austere lifestyle. Marriage to him would definitively end any possibility of a future with Frederick, precisely her father's intention. When Dorina returned to the Empress Dowager's sitting room, the old woman took one look at her face and dismissed her other attendants. "Bad news from home?" she inquired once they were alone. "My father has arranged my marriage," Dorina replied, her voice hollow. "To Count Telecki." The Empress's expression darkened. "Without consulting you or me? You are in my service. Protocol requires my permission before arrangements are finalized. He presents it as already decided. The contracts are signed, only my signature remains." Dorina handed the letter to the Empress, who read it with increasing disapproval. "This is coercion, not proper negotiation," she declared, returning the letter. "And Count Telecki? The man opposed my husband at every turn, calling him the German usurper even at state functions." She studied Dorina carefully. "Do you wish this marriage?" "No, Your Majesty," Dorina answered truthfully. "But I see no path to refuse without causing greater difficulty for everyone involved." "Including my son," the Empress observed. Dorina looked away, unable to deny it. "The Emperor and we acknowledged the impossibility of our situation before he departed. This merely confirms what we already knew." "Does it?" The Empress rose, moving to her writing desk. "I find it confirms only your father's political opportunism and disregard for your happiness." She began writing rapidly. "I shall respond to Count Balogh directly. As your imperial patron, I can delay any marriage arrangements until Frederick returns. Beyond that..." She glanced up. "Much depends on choices yet to be made." That night, alone in her room, Dorina removed the tower key from its hiding place. Running her fingers over its intricate pattern, she contemplated the brief happiness she had found in Frederick's company, and the duty now calling her back to a life where such joy would be forbidden. With sudden resolve, she dressed in a simple gown and cloak, then made her way through the quiet palace to the library. The hidden door opened silently to her key, and she climbed the spiral staircase to the tower room. Vienna spread before her, peaceful under the moonlight. Somewhere to the east, Frederick was grappling with imperial concerns, perhaps thinking of her as she thought of him. The distance between them was more than physical, it was a chasm of duty, tradition, and political necessity that no personal feeling, however profound, could bridge. Dorina remained in the tower until dawn, coming to terms with the sacrifices her position demanded. When she descended, she left the key on a small table near the window, a silent acknowledgement that some doors were better left unopened. Frederick returned to Schönbrunn 3 weeks later, his border negotiations successfully concluded but his personal dilemma no closer to resolution. Distance had only confirmed what he already knew, his feelings for Dorina transcended mere attraction or novelty. The question remained whether imperial duty could accommodate such feelings. His first evening back was consumed by reports and council meetings. The following morning brought a private audience with his mother, who received him in her apartments with unusual formality. "Welcome home," she said, allowing him to kiss her cheek. "I trust your journey was productive." "The eastern provinces are secured for now," Frederick replied, noting her serious expression. "What troubles you, mother?" "You dispatched the attendants, which suggests private matters." "Indeed." She handed him a letter bearing Count Balogh's seal. "This arrived during your absence. Read it, then we shall discuss implications." Frederick scanned the document, his expression darkening with each paragraph. Count Balogh requested the immediate release of his daughter from imperial service, citing her impending marriage to Count Telecki and family obligations that supersede court duties. "This is unexpected," Frederick said carefully, returning the letter. "Is it," his mother challenged, "or merely unwelcome?" "Both," he admitted after a moment. "I was aware of complications, but not this development." He paced toward the window, then back. "Has Lady Balogh confirmed this arrangement?" "She received similar notification from her father." The marriage contracts await only her signature. The Empress studied her son. She believes she has no choice but to comply. Frederick's jaw tightened. And what do you believe, mother? I believe my son has fallen in love with a woman whose position makes conventional courtship impossible, she replied directly. I also believe Count Balogh has orchestrated this marriage precisely to prevent any possibility of imperial entanglement with his daughter. Count Telecki is among Vienna's most vocal critics, Frederick observed. This match politically aligns the Balogh family with Hungarian separatist factions. Yes, the politics are quite transparent, his mother agreed. But I'm more concerned with the human cost. Dorina would be miserable in such a marriage. As would I in a marriage of state with some German princess while knowing. Frederick stopped himself. It's an impossible situation. Only if you insist on conventional solutions. The Empress Dowager rose, moving to join her son at the window. Your father faced similar opposition when he insisted on marrying me, a Hungarian countess with no royal blood. The court was scandalized, his advisers predicted disaster. The circumstances were different, Frederick argued. The empire wasn't facing nationalist movements in every province, Hungary wasn't demanding autonomy. Perhaps addressing those demands requires new approaches, not simply military firmness, she suggested. A gesture of genuine partnership between Austria and Hungary might accomplish what force cannot. Frederick understood her implication immediately. You're suggesting a marriage to Dorina could be politically advantageous? The council would never support such a match. The council serves the emperor doesn't serve the council, she reminded him. But before considering any such dramatic steps, you should speak with Dorina. She has kept to herself these past weeks, declining most social engagements. Where is she now? In the East Garden Pavilion, reading. She goes there most mornings. The Empress smiled slightly. I suggested she might enjoy the solitude today particularly. Frederick kissed his mother's hand gratefully. You've always seen more clearly than most, mother. Age brings perspective, my son. Now go, before duty claims your day entirely. The East Garden Pavilion stood at the far end of Schönbrunns formal gardens, a small neoclassical structure rarely visited by courtiers due to its distance from the palace. As Frederick approached, he saw Dorina seated on a stone bench, a book open in her lap though her gaze was directed at the distant mountains. She rose immediately when she noticed him, curtsying deeply. Your Majesty! Welcome back to Schönbrunn. Thank you, Lady Balogh. Frederick gestured for her to sit and joined her on the bench, maintaining a proper distance. I understand congratulations may be in order. Dorina's expression revealed nothing. News travels quickly at court. My mother received your father's letter requesting your release from service. He studied her carefully. Is this marriage your choice, Dorina? Does it matter? She asked quietly. Daughters of noble houses rarely marry for personal preference. It matters to me, Frederick replied. If you desire this match, I will wish you happiness and we shall speak no more of other possibilities. But if you're being coerced, not coerced, she interrupted. Merely reminded of my duty to family and country. As you were reminded of yours during your eastern sojourn, I imagine. Frederick was silent for a moment, weighing his next words carefully. I've spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself that imperial duty requires sacrificing personal happiness. That the traditions of centuries must outweigh the wishes of one man's heart. And did you succeed? Dorina asked, finally meeting his gaze directly. No, he admitted. Instead, I began questioning whether an emperor who cannot create happiness in his own life can truly foster it within his empire. A philosophical dilemma, she observed, but one that doesn't alter the practical realities we face. Perhaps not, Frederick acknowledged. But it might change how we approach those realities. He reached for her hand, propriety momentarily forgotten. I don't want you to marry Count Telecki. Dorina didn't withdraw her hand, though her expression remained guarded. What do you want, Frederick? Time, he answered honestly. Time to find a path that honors both our duties and our hearts. Will you grant me that much before signing any marriage contracts? Hope flickered briefly in her eyes before caution reasserted itself. My father expects an answer within days. The proxy arrives tomorrow. Then we have until tomorrow to determine our course, Frederick said, his voice taking on the decisive tone he used for imperial declarations. Meet me tonight in the tower room. Whatever we decide, we shall face it together rather than surrendering separately to others' expectations. Before she could respond, voices approached along the garden path, courtiers enjoying a morning stroll. Frederick stood, resuming proper imperial bearing. Thank you for your insights on Hungarian literature, Lady Balogh, he said formally as the courtiers came into view. My mother was right to recommend your expertise. Dorina rose and curtsied. I'm honored by your Majesty's interest in our cultural heritage. As Frederick walked away, acknowledging the bowing courtiers with a nod, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. Uncertainty remained, but the decision to act rather than merely accept fate had restored his sense of purpose. That night, as palace clocks chimed midnight, Frederick ascended the tower stairs with uncharacteristic nervousness. He had spent the day in careful consultation with trusted advisers, testing political waters without revealing his personal stake in the questions he raised. The tower room was empty when he arrived. A single lamp burned near the window, but there was no sign of Dorina. His heart sank as minutes passed with no sound on the stairs. Then, just as he began to fear she wouldn't come, the door opened. Dorina entered, still wearing her formal evening gown from dinner, a deep blue creation that highlighted her eyes. I wasn't sure you would come, Frederick said, echoing her words from weeks earlier. Nor was I, she admitted, remaining near the door. The proxy arrived this evening rather than tomorrow. He awaits my signature on the marriage contract. Frederick's expression tightened. Your father's urgency suggests he fears interference. With good reason, it seems. She moved further into the room. Before coming here, I received a surprising visitor, the Empress Dowager herself, in my private quarters. My mother. Frederick hadn't anticipated this development. What did she want? To show me something I hadn't considered. Dorina approached slowly. She brought historical documents, imperial decrees from your grandfather's reign establishing precedents for marriages between Habsburg rulers and Hungarian nobility. Rare but not unprecedented. Hope surged within Frederick. She didn't consult me about this. No, Dorina smiled slightly. She said some matters are better addressed by women while men concern themselves with appearances of propriety. That sounds like her, Frederick acknowledged, closing the remaining distance between them. What else did my interfering mother suggest? That happiness and duty need not be opposing forces, Dorina replied. And that an emperor has certain prerogatives in matrimonial matters that override even a father's authority. Frederick took her hands in his. Is she right? Could duty and happiness align in this case? Perhaps, Dorina said cautiously. But the political implications remain complex. My father's faction would view any match between us as Hungarian capitulation to Austrian authority unless balanced by meaningful concessions. Such as the language provisions I already granted. Frederick asked. Or perhaps a constitutional role for the Hungarian Diet in imperial governance. Dorina's eyes widened. You've been considering such measures? Since our midnight discussion weeks ago, he confirmed. My Eastern journey included consultations with moderate Hungarian leaders about possible reforms, a federal structure that preserves imperial unity while acknowledging national identities. You never mentioned this, she said, surprised. Because I needed to determine if such accommodations were politically viable before. Frederick hesitated. Before asking a more personal question. Understanding dawned in Dorina's expression. Frederick, not yet, he interrupted gently. There's one matter we haven't addressed. Count Telecki awaits your signature on a marriage contract. Your father expects compliance. Yes, she acknowledged. By morning, I must either sign or formally refuse. And if you refuse, I defy my father, possibly alienate my family, and certainly create political complications for Hungarian moderates who have supported your recent concessions." Dorina's voice was steady despite the gravity of her words. "It's no small matter." Frederick nodded, his expression solemn. "Nor is this." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small document bearing the Imperial seal. "A different contract, should you wish to consider an alternative path." Dorina accepted the document with trembling hands, breaking the seal to reveal its contents. As she read, her eyes filled with tears. "An imperial betrothal contract," she whispered. "Frederick, this would cause a sensation throughout Europe." "Yes," he agreed. "But it would also bridge a divide that has threatened the empire for generations. The Hungarian Countess and the Austrian Emperor, a union symbolizing the partnership our peoples must forge if the empire is to survive. Your advisors have been consulted, discreetly," he assured her. "Some approve on strategic grounds, others will accept it as imperial prerogative. My mother has already begun cultivating support among key court factions." "And my father?" "The Hungarian nationalists will receive concessions meaningful enough to claim victory while preserving imperial unity," Frederick explained. "A constitutional monarchy with genuine power sharing, something I've been considering since our conversations began." Dorina looked up from the document, searching his face. "Is this politics or love, Frederick?" "Both," he answered honestly. "I am emperor, I cannot separate my personal choices from their political consequences. But know this," he took her face gently between his hands, "I would not propose such a path if my heart weren't fully committed to the woman who once looked at me without fear or flattery, who challenges my thinking, who makes me consider not just what an emperor should do, but what a man should be." Tears spilled onto her cheeks. "I never imagined, when you mistook me for a servant that first day, that it would lead to this moment." "Nor did I," Frederick smiled. "My heart never recovered from that encounter, when for one brief moment, I was simply a man who had carelessly collided with a beautiful woman." "And now?" Dorina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now I am an emperor asking if you, Countess Dorina Balogh, will consider an imperial alliance of the most personal nature, a marriage binding not just our lives but perhaps the future of nations." Dorina's smile bloomed through her tears. "A rather grand proposal, Your Majesty. Does it require an equally grand response?" Frederick asked, suddenly uncharacteristically uncertain. "No," she replied, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. "Just a simple one, yes." As they embraced in the tower room high above Schönbrunns gardens, dawn began breaking over the eastern provinces, a new day for the empire, and for the emperor who had mistaken a countess for a servant, and whose heart had never quite recovered from the error.